hands-on learning and whether it's an effective means of teaching in a standards-based world. So we'll kind of come back to that in more detail, but I want to start with a simple poll. And the question is, sorry, I'm finding the question here. Basically, is hands-on learning good for student learning? So as we collect some responses here, I'm going to let it go for maybe another 10 seconds or so. I get to see things on the back end of here where we believe. Okay, so I'm closing the poll and I'm going to share the results. The great news is we're all in agreement here. I have to say that the poll was definitely a little bit of a playing to the crowd. Since you all signed up for the webinar, I assume you believe this. So I just did this nice little scientific study, and according to this, 100% of the population really loves hands-on learning. And I agree, when kids are using their hands to make things and explore the world, there's potential for that activity to be really, really meaningful. We've all seen this in our various classrooms or after-school programs, whatever we've done. But today the task is, what do we really mean by quote-unquote hands-on? It's a term that gets tossed around pretty liberally, and it applies to lots of different activities. But I think we as educators can do our part to think critically about what that really means. So just to kind of give you a sense of hands-on and how broad this is, the sphere or spectrum of hands-on has lumped together a lot of different things. We've got the kind of rich, meaningful experiences that I'm sure many of you have seen and experienced, but also in this quote-unquote hands-on camp are things like maybe more canned science curricula, where sure kids are using their hands, but really they're answer seeking. They're not really experimenting, but they're in this mode of following procedures and arriving at a correct answer and not really doing much thinking. Similarly, although this might be met with some objection, math manipulatives have become one of these things that is branded as a cure-all in mathematics. And unfortunately, the research kind of challenges that. It says that manipulatives have very specific advantages in certain contexts. But across the board, they're not necessarily going to solve all of our mathematical woes. So when we use this label hands-on, it's not just thinking about whether or not the kid's hands are literally touching something. It's thinking critically about what our goals are and whether or not the kid's touching something, the kid's making things, is really of benefit to this particular learning goal. So I want to encourage all of us to have this warning that just because it's labeled hands-on does not mean it works. And I know that probably doesn't come as a surprise. This sort of warning is not new. We apply it to lots of different trends in education. For example, group learning isn't always the best way to do it, but sometimes it's wonderful. Technology, saying blindly, let's apply technology to classrooms without really considering what that technology is there to do, also has some problems. Differentiated instruction, you know, we toss these terms out there without critically examining, well, are they really differentiated? Are we actually excluding students by differentiating? Are we including others? So these popular trends in education are always, I think, subjected to this label as good when we have the skills and resources to think a little bit more critically about that. So I want to move on from that to ask all of you to think for a moment about why you like hands-on activities. So our poll is now posted. There are 5 options. The first is hands-on activities allow students to work with their own ideas. Option 2 is they keep students engaged. Option 3, they work for a range of learners. Option 4, they facilitate students learning from each other. And option 5, they allow me, the teacher, to see students thinking in different ways. Now we're forcing you to select what you might consider to be the most important. I realize some of you may want to select more than one of these. So I'll wait for a minute to see what kinds of things begin to trend and pop up amongst us. We've got 62% of us voted. All right, we're doing pretty well. I'm going to close the poll in about 2 or 3 seconds here because we've got a good chunk of folks here. So here are the results. And I think this is pretty interesting. So 17% of us said that they allow students to work with their own ideas, and the same percentage said that they allow students, or that allows students to remain engaged. 21% works for a range of learners, 8% facilitates students learning from each other, and 38% says it allows the teachers to see their students' ideas in different ways. That's great. So I want to take a step before really addressing the results of the poll to ask the question, what makes for good learning with technology? So I'm going to propose basically 5 ideas about this, and they're open for debate, and hopefully you'll question them. But at the beginning, we're talking about starting with students' ideas. So in my opinion, good technologies really capture students' ideas and provide ways for those ideas to expand and grow. Not only just for the student, but also in the ways that they're conceptualized, the ways that they're shared and experienced, the types of forms they take. When we allow students' ideas to grow, naturally we keep students engaged in the problem. Remember, it's their idea that is now being shown in different ways or in new, cool, interesting simulations. At the same time, because the sphere of ways of engaging with my ideas is bigger, we could argue we're reaching more learners in the classroom. So take a step back and say, okay, I've got 20, 25, 30 students, and here we go. There are a bunch of student ideas on the table. The nice thing with technology is oftentimes one student's ideas starts to come into contact with another. So this might be through conversation, this might be through the robotics device they built or the particular mousetrap car contraption they built. So these 2 students are now talking about their ideas through the product they built, through the thing that they constructed using some form of technology. And as we expand that to include more and more and more students, what we do is create this space in the middle of the triangle. And what the space affords are the opportunities to have students negotiating their understandings, coming to agreements or disagreements about the way they see the world, ultimately arriving at some sort of shared meaning about what's going on. And I think what the research has shown us is that they spend more time thinking about the concepts, the science, the math, the English, whatever it may be. They spend more time focused on these ideas as opposed to kind of the extraneous process mechanisms of schooling. So this space is really, really powerful, and I think when you take this idea of hands-on and this idea of technological affordances and group all these student ideas together to create some sort of student-generated product like is on the screen, we have this new window into student thinking. We have this new ideas about how they see the world, and we have now this product, this thing, be it a digital device or something made with Lego or other kinds of construction kits. This device, this product, is a way for us, the teachers, to begin talking to them about their ideas. And that's really, really critical if we're trying to create meaningful learning experiences. So the good news is, as the poll suggests, or as I just suggested, you are all correct. These 5 ideas that I'm putting forth right now are kind of the ways that we think about what makes for meaningful hands-on activities, and specifically meaningful hands-on activities in the context of technological tools and technological environments. So I want to jump into an example so that we can contextualize this conversation a little bit. So let's take the question that may arise maybe in upper elementary through middle school, right on actually through high school chemistry and into college. How do molecules move at different temperatures? So what we really have here, we do have a real-world problem, right? Molecules comprise the entirety of our universe at some form or another. We'll say particles. So it's a very real-world problem in that these kinds of ways of modeling the world are the world we live in, but molecules are unseen. So how can technology and a hands-on activity kind of foster students thinking about these ideas? So here's a video that some middle school students made in response to that prompt. They took relatively simple materials, some paper, some markers, and what you see there are dried beans, and they generated this frame-by-frame stop-action movie that shows their thinking about how molecules move at different temperatures in a liquid. So you see it starts with cool liquid, and they're moving a little bit relatively close together. Warm liquid, they move faster and further apart. And finally, hot liquid, they're buzzing all around, and they've taken up quite a bit of space. The interesting thing is, here is their product. They've put their idea on the table, right? This is the student's way of thinking about molecules at different temperatures. So now we can ask questions. And in this particular classroom, one of the questions that immediately emerged was, wait a minute, you're showing that this liquid basically triples in volume when I go from cool to hot. Is that true? Is that really the case? And that question is really, really powerful because it kind of gives us a way to begin furthering our understanding of molecules and materials and temperature. So in this particular class, they moved on from that animation to test their hypothesis. Here's a graduated cylinder that they heated slowly over time and took a time-lapse animation of this. to show that, lo and behold, when you heat a liquid, it does expand. I'll try and play that again. I'm not sure whether people will be able to see it. But when you heat a liquid, it does expand. Does it triple in volume? Of course not. But now we've got some better ways of seeing the world, and more importantly, we have a mechanism for explaining this. We know that molecules move faster and further apart at different temperatures. So this creates kind of an important and exciting opportunity for kids to put their ideas out there as facilitated by some technology while using their hand and producing something to engage with a pretty complicated idea with how molecules move at different temperatures. So I want to kind of move from that example, and I apologize if I'm going quickly here, but I'm trying to honor our time constraints, to another poll that kind of launches into the topic of this particular webinar, which is, can hands-on approaches teach the standards? And it's purposefully vague. Standards is not defined specifically in this situation because we all have these challenges, but your options are yes, yes, but it is very hard and takes time, or no, the standards are too much of a constraint to make this work. So I'll give this another few seconds to collect some responses. I'll tell you from behind the scenes, I'm really liking what I'm seeing because it's in agreement with where I am. Maybe I'm giving away the ending here. So we've got a decent percentage of the folks in, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results with you. 81% of the group says that hands-on activities can teach the standards. 10% says, sure, but it's hard and it takes a lot of time, which I think is a very astute observation. And 10% say no, they're too constraining. So let's move on to this a little bit and take a step back and think about what we mean by standards and what they're really there to do and what we can do with them. So as many people have heard, there is this new push to adopt a common core standard across all the country, every state in the nation. And if you live in any state other than Alaska, Minnesota, Nebraska, or Texas, your state is moving in this direction. Those are the only holdouts at this point. To standardize what states and districts think students should know at the end of certain courses. So for English and math, these are the Common Core standards, and for science, they're being developed by the National Research Council in their NRC K-12 science frameworks. So these things are going to be what eventually translate into the more district or state level things like you'd see in New York in their scope and sequence, which is a version of these Common Core standards or NRC standards pushed into the schools using particular states' ways of doing things. The thing that's really interesting about this new move is there is an emergence of disciplinary practices in the new standards. And believe me, I'm not a big fan of the standards. I think they do pose a lot of challenges for educators. But this new trend to include disciplinary practices, which basically means how do scientists do science? How do mathematicians do math? How do writers engage with their process? What do different literacies mean? These disciplinary practices are becoming a bigger part of what the states think that students should know. And I see that as a great opportunity for us. Specifically, the Common Core cites that one of their design considerations was a focus on results rather than means, which in effect means they're giving the reins to teachers to say, you teach how you would like to. We're going to look for whether or not students can do these things that we ask using whatever means you see fit. So I know you're probably in this state of, well, great, everybody says that hands-on works, everybody says that it can do all that we need it to do, but the realities of the standards are pretty tough. Well, I want to give you just some evidence from a couple studies that suggest that when we do use this hands-on or a more inclusive student idea-oriented approach to education, it works. So there's been some work going on here at Tufts in conjunction with Turk, which is a nonprofit research organization in Cambridge, around the idea of early algebra. And they did a longitudinal study with a lot of 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders in Boston and other cities around the idea of algebraic thinking. So these were focusing on the practices of mathematics, modeling, using different representations, generalizing relationships between things. This is what algebra really is. And this project tried to see whether or not elementary school students could do it effectively. The great news is they learned algebra, which was a kind of monumental finding, that 3rd graders are very capable of doing algebra, of working with variables, of graphing, of using functions, doing really high-level stuff. But what's even more interesting is that these same students, these 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, not only outperformed their peers on standardized measures, But when given 8th grade items, they also outperformed the 8th graders on the algebra MCAS. So here's an approach. Here's a student-centered, expansive approach to teaching, the way that I just defined, these 5 principles that we talked about, that yielded pretty impressive results. So because you are taking this, student-oriented approach to education does not mean you are necessarily suffering when it comes to student performance. So some other folks who've been thinking about this intersection between curriculum and standards have proposed this, or have this to say. The success of standards and curriculum frameworks rests on instructional materials aligned with these goals. Thus, current U.S. reform efforts in science education strive to align instructional materials and assessments with local, state, and national standards. However, few curriculum materials succeed in meeting standards. And they're right. Many of these curricula that are designed not to be super thoughtful do not do a good job of matching what is being asked of students in terms of what are the content and the particular learning assessments or learning performances that are put forth. So Joe Krychek's group proposed this model. They said, when designing some kind of experience for students, or a learning performance as they call it, you need to think not only about the stuff, the content, but also the practices. How are students engaging with the content? So summarized kind of in everyday speak below, we say, what are the ideas we want students to think about? What are the ways, the practices in which we want them to think about these ideas? And what are they actually going to do? What are they going to make for us? What are they going to produce? What is this learning performance that gives us a window into how they're thinking? So going back to that example I showed you of the Cool Beans movie, which is what the students called it, engaging with the idea of molecules at different temperatures, we can map this model onto this activity, right? The content standard was particular ways of thinking about molecular motion. The practice in this case is coming up with an innovative way of modeling how things change over time. By the way, modeling change over time is calculus. So we're showing that kids can engage with pretty high-level content spheres by doing it in different ways. The particular learning performance in this case was using SAM animation, a simple, easy-to-use stop-motion animation software that was designed specifically for schools and for students to make these kinds of animated models, to take simple, everyday materials, to work with their hand and build up expressions of their thinking in this kind of digital artifact. So to kind of come back to this question of can hands-on approaches teach the standards, our argument would be definitely, and thankfully a good chunk of you all agree with that statement. When we say hands-on, what we are really talking about are carefully designed activities that focus on student thinking, focus on their ideas, at the same time keep more learners engaged while fostering collaboration and learning from each other. And that's kind of the piece that some people I think were a little skeptical about, so let's dig into that one a little bit. How do we really kind of foster collaboration and learning from each other using technology in a hands-on environment? So when we make this type of learning digital, this digital thing, again in my example the stop motion animation, but it could be video of a robot that you've done, or actually building some sort of mechanism or circuitry. There's all kinds of things that fall into this box of digital thing. Very easily, using YouTube or a whole variety of platforms, we can take that thing and send it home. And parents can now engage in this conversation with their students. Rich was actually sharing recently about a really powerful moment where his daughter's school made animations about a particular topic, and it brought that conversation to their dinner table. And all of a sudden, what happened at school wasn't the, oh, we just had fun things today, Dad. We're actually talking about relatively complex and interesting ideas. So it gives us a new way to get students' schoolwork into homes and outside of the school environment. It also allows for a kind of collaboration over great distances. We've been doing some work at iCreate and at Tufts with Singapore and finding that these digital products allow us to share the things that students are doing in the US with the things that students are doing in Singapore, and we've come to some really interesting realizations there. It also allows you to do this within the school, sharing things with other classes. And finally, these digital products become a record of how students' ideas and thinking and skills have developed over the course of the year. So we think when you make it digital, you're doing something that allows these things to live beyond the moment and allow students to really share and learn from each other. Because let's face it, we built dioramas when we were younger, and they tend to sit in closets and collect dust. So what we're really pushing for is a challenge to all of you moving forward to kind of answer and address this question of how can we design meaningful hands-on activities, You can replace activities there for curricula. These are the things your students do in your classroom. How can we design meaningful hands-on activities with technology that, one, allow students to work with their own ideas, two, keep students engaged, obviously because it's their ideas they're working with, three, when we include a broader range of students' ideas, we're including a broader range of learners, so how can we do that more effectively? Four, how can we encourage and facilitate students learning from each other, either with technology or the design of the activities themselves? And finally, how do we use these products, these ways of students engaging with the math, the science, the English, the social studies, whatever it may be, to see their thinking in new and different ways so that we can move them further along these paths of developing sophisticated ways of seeing and understanding the world. So I'm going to stop talking and say thank you for tuning in. I hope most of you are still here and not asleep. And I think with that, Rich, I believe we're going to open it up for some questions.
Sure. So the first question I would have for you, Brian, is there a particular sweet spot for this meaningful hands-on learning in terms of the age or grade level of the student?
That's a great question. The optimist in me says absolutely not, and the realist in me says that you have to think about what your students are capable of at certain ages. Dropping a really complicated breadboard and robotics platform with syntax-based programming language in front of kindergartners probably doesn't make the most sense. But you all, as educators, and I'm making the assumption that many of you are educators, so apologies to those who may not be, but as educators, you're aware of kind of the limits and the boundaries of students' thinking. And what I'm encouraging you to do is think about where hands-on technological type activities can exist around these boundaries and edges of their thinking. Because what we may learn is that our previously conceived boundaries aren't right, and they're capable of much more. But we also want to put them in situations where they are successful. So let me tell you a little example about working with some pretty young kids around the idea of the life cycle of a butterfly, which is a popular kindergarten, first grade kind of thing. They engaged in modeling this process by doing lots of research in books, going out and observing butterflies, trying to grow them themselves in their classroom, and putting forth a stop-motion animation of this process. They built a beautiful movie. I'd show it to you if I could. It's definitely on the iCreate website. They built a beautiful movie that wasn't done in 20 or 30 minutes. It was done over the course of a couple weeks. So the technology was still able to facilitate this really rich and interesting experience for them that worked from their ideas, that allowed many kids to participate in the activity, that allowed the teacher to see where their thinking was. But it looked different in the kindergarten than it might in a middle school where that same kind of activity would be 30, 40 minutes. So is there a sweet spot? I don't think so, but again, that's the eternal optimist speaking. There are always constraints and realities in each of your classrooms at different ages that are going to dictate what's possible. Just so you know, we have graduate students who do this kind of work as well, so there's no real ceiling as far as I'm concerned. I hope that does a decent job kind of addressing that question.
Sure. Okay, the next question is, how would you enable students with physical special needs to access some of these hands-on learning tools and technology?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of work in the assistive, There's a lot of work in the assistive technology field that's trying to broaden the ways that we get kids to, who do have particular physical disabilities engaged in these processes. I would encourage you, if you aren't aware, of exploring an organization called CAST, who does universal design for learning. That's the idea that they've championed. And they have a set of guidelines that help us think about how we can broaden the points of access, and more importantly than just the points of access, other ways of getting students engaged in the problem. But I'll focus on access right now. They have a set of guidelines that essentially outline how we can take the student's particular abilities into consideration and find ways of working with that. So, you know, if we're talking about, for example, a student who has cerebral palsy and has pretty limited control of their hands or use of their hands, we're going to need to think differently about what that activity looks like compared to other students who may have fine motor skills that can manipulate small parts and pieces. So the nice thing about some of these digital technologies is there are different input devices. that don't rely solely on mouses and keyboards, that have a broader range of input. And some of these devices have been programmed to control different types of software on computers, so that the students become part of this group where some students may be working with the materials on the table, others may be working with the computer, and others may be kind of chiming in as directors or facilitators of this experience. But unfortunately, my area of expertise is not in disability education. There are a lot of really brilliant and wonderful folks out there doing that work. But I would encourage you start by looking at CAST's website and Universal Design for Learning, and see where that sends you. And you have Rich's information, and I'm happy to respond to some of those questions offline too, if that's helpful.
Okay. All right, the next question is there data available with students that continually use hands-on approaches? What is the saturation point? Or I guess, is there a saturation point?
Yeah, it's a good question. Probably. So the realities are, right, like anything, and that's that warning that I put up at the beginning, there is such a thing as too much. However, there are some places out there, like High Tech High in San Diego, and some of the expeditionary learning schools, that have shown that hands-on can take lots of different forms. It doesn't always mean that students are necessarily making something. It could be that they're spending time discussing and writing about and analyzing and critiquing the things that they've made. And those places are showing that there's actually a pretty high threshold for the amount of time students can be making and working with things in their learning experience. But I'm a pretty firm believer that at some point we need to pause and reflect on the work that we've done. You know, there are extremes to this. Montessori and some extreme constructivists would argue that it is only through the engagement between the object, the things in the world, and the subject, the person, the student, that knowledge is built. But I think there's a lot to be gained by taking a step back from the activities that we've done, and spending some time discussing and reflecting them. I'd say one of my bigger frustrations going into schools is I see activities that are fantastic. They're creative, they're constructive, kids are making really great and interesting things, but unfortunately the lessons run out of time before the students have a chance to take a step back and talk to each other about their ideas. What ideas are present in the things they've made and the ways they've been thinking about them? How do these ideas relate? Are there properties we can generalize and abstract from this? Because when we think about, and particularly in math and science, we have all sorts of instances of phenomena or instances of some mathematical relationship. But the true task is moving out, is zooming out from that, and basically achieving at some more generalizable trend that describes a lot of different situations. And if we don't build space into that hands-on world for students to spend time reflecting and thinking critical about what ideas they've engaged with while doing the hands-on stuff, I don't think it's quite as powerful. So in terms of saturation, I would say, you know, you can do a lot of hands-on activities in the course of a year as long as there's sufficient time built in so that students have time to work with those ideas and allow them to digest and begin to see how they relate to each other and how they can be generalized.
Okay. Next question is, how do you break up a stop animation activity so that all the students are involved and a class of 20 to 30 second to third grade students? So how do we keep everyone involved if you have a room full of 20 to 30 second grade students?
Yeah, so we run into this challenge a lot, and there's a few factors to consider. One is purely technological. How many computers do you have? How many cameras do you have? How many kids can be making animations at the same time? That's probably the most pressing concern. If you have 2 computers and 30 students, we have to think a little differently about this. But let's for the moment assume that you've got a laptop cart or a computer lab or something like that where students are all working on an animation simultaneously. So one thing that we do definitely recommend is that you do not have groups of more than 2 or 3. And again, that's resource intensive. You need a lot of stuff in order to have small groups. But the bigger the group, the more we find the ideas become, or the non-essential members of the group become distracting. Only so many kids can be working on the thing at the same time. Maybe a kid moving parts underneath the camera and another kid grabbing frames. So if there are too many other folks involved, it doesn't work so well. So groups of 2 to 3 have been kind of the most effective on that front. But in terms of structuring the overall start-to-finish animation process, we are big believers, and I am a huge believer in the importance of storyboarding. So before the kids get any stuff, I think they should spend some time thinking about what is their story and what are the particular moments in their story that they want to focus on and describe. That not only forces them to organize the story of their animation, but also begins to let them know what they need to begin building in terms of props and things to go in their movie. So that stuff could happen in one class when you're not planning on animating until later. That could be done as homework. That could be done in lots of different ways. Once they've storyboarded, I think it's also really cool to have students share their storyboards in, kind of a group setting or a maybe more of a focus group setting with the teacher. Have them practice talking through that idea, because not only do they start to see where there might be inconsistencies or holes in their story, but they learn a lot from each other and hearing how other people are thinking about it. So now you've got kind of two things to chunk it. One is making the storyboard. Two is sharing the storyboard. Three would be the kind of production of the things that are going to go in the animation. I've seen a lot of teachers assign this as homework assignment or work with the art teacher to do some of that work outside of the English or social studies or math or science classroom. So the prop making can be a chunk that you pull aside. And in our experience, when there's a good storyboard, when the students know what they need to do, and when they have their props ready to go, most kids, yes, even in grades 2 and 3, are pretty good at making their movie in one sitting, in one 60, 70-minute sitting. But you need to do a lot of work beforehand, because if they haven't really conceptualized what they want to do when they sit down in front of that software, they tend to allow their imaginations to go wild, which is awesome and great for a whole bunch of reasons, but we all have real needs and real goals for these movies. So if a lot of the work has been done leading up to the quote-unquote filming of our animation, we find that that filming can happen pretty quickly. We were recently in Singapore with 100 teams of K through 12 students, some of whom were really young, and they had done a lot of planning in the forefront, and they came in and filmed animations start to finish, making props and everything else, just because of the amount of planning they had done in under 2 hours. So I was pretty impressed with how on task they were able to stay. I do know that it's a real challenge whenever you need to stop that animating process in the middle and save and move on, because when students come back and need to reopen files and all these kinds of things, it's a real that can be a real problem. But I think the more work you do on the front to front load the experience, so that making the animation is actually a relatively short part of it, it goes well, and then you hopefully leave yourself some time to talk about those animations. Like I mentioned, reflection and discussing what you made is probably just as critical as making it itself. So I hope that helps give you some ideas to work with.
And we have time for a couple more questions. I'm also just going to add one thing to what Brian just said, to add a point about this 20 to 30 students. My daughter's class, second grade, they were, as Brian mentioned, focused on the country of Ghana. And to help keep the project moving, they divided into 7 groups of 3. And then what they did from there is each group had a separate topic that they were working on. But to Brian's point, it started with an inquiry wall, kids writing down questions. Then from there, they formed the teams. Then from there, they did research. And then from there, they did a storyboard. They wrote a script. And then the last thing they did was put it all together with the stop motion. So the teacher, in this case, was very excited because it touched on so many different areas. And then what they did was they took the 7 different movies and combined them into one at the end. So that was a way to keep everyone involved. So I just share that. Let's see, we have a minute or 2 left. So I'm going to combine these 2 questions. So is there a difference between hands-on and inquiry approach? And how would you recommend integrating prior knowledge of students, or integrating students' prior knowledge before introducing information and content?
Fantastic. Both really, really great questions. And if you're in and around Tufts anytime, I actually teach a course that addresses these 2 questions. So to first address this notion of hands-on and inquiry, to me, hands-on is more about the environment. What are students doing? in terms of, are they making things with their hands? Are they assembling, constructing? Are they manipulating things that are already built? To me, it's more of the mechanics of the classroom environment. Inquiry, to me, is an approach that puts the students' questioning and their ideas and thinking at the forefront of the learning activity, right? So I don't see these two as separate necessarily, but I also think inquiry can occur without hands-on, believe it or not. There's a lot that can be beneficial in asking questions and having kids discuss their ways of seeing the world that doesn't necessarily involve playing with stuff. For example, there's a lot of great work that happens in social studies, tackling challenging issues of race, ethnicity, things like that. Those are inquiries in that students are trying to make sense of the world by exploring it and asking authentic questions about how it works and how we may be able to describe and understand it. So I don't see those two things as different. I see one maybe as more how we think about the environment that we put our students in, and the other as the type of learning we want our students to do, the second being inquiry. So thinking about prior knowledge, the reason that I put students' ideas at the forefront of just about everything we do is because that is, in a sense, the prior knowledge they bring to the table. I believe that the most effective education spends time before engaging with any sort of target, so in this case maybe molecular motion, eliciting from the students the ways they are thinking about these particular ideas. So it means sometimes coming up with an interesting little phenomena or gig or question or something like that. So there's actually some great books out there. I'm blanking on some of the names of them right now, unfortunately. But there's a lot of really great books that have these kind of little physics demos, these things that challenge your intuition and don't go the way that you think they're going to go. And those are great little things to ask students to throw ideas out there. Tell me what you think is going on. And in this moment, you don't allow students to actually tell you the answers in terms of vocabulary or maybe canonical phrases. You're asking for their reasoning, right? So they may say, you know, why does this thing continue to roll down the ramp? Oh, it's because of momentum. That's not an acceptable answer in the way I think about it. Well, why would momentum be any part of this conversation? That doesn't tell me why the ball rolls down the ramp. That's a label to somebody else's term. So give me your reasoning, the guts of your reasoning. And as we spend time as teachers eliciting the guts of students' thinking, the ways that they are able to link cause and effect, those processes that explain the middle ground between a cause and an effect, the more we take that prior knowledge and see where it is, how productive or unproductive it may be, and how we can begin to supplement that with different activities that may challenge some of the ideas that arise. So I have a really fun, simple activity you can try if you want to play around with this idea. I ask students a lot whether or not a bowling ball or a feather, when dropped at the same time, will hit the ground at the same time. We all know the answer to that. The bowling ball hits every time. It's the most repeatable experiment you could do. But unfortunately, when they get to high school or even middle school physics, they learn that all things fall at the same rate. And they begin to interpret that in the physics context as meaning that the bowling ball and the feather are supposed to hit at the same rate. And they're stuck in this conundrum. The physics is telling me a different thing than I've observed for my entire life. So a way to do it is to say, okay, take a piece of paper and another piece of paper that you crumple up into a tight ball. Drop them simultaneously, and the tight ball piece of paper will fall faster than the one that's not crumpled up. And then the task you ask for the student is see if you can explore how you make that flat piece of paper fall like the crumpled one or that crumpled one fall like the flat one, and see what you can say about factors that influence the falling of things. I've done this with a lot of elementary school students, and it's amazing how they all arrive at this idea of air resistance. So I could tell them the reason those two things fall differently is because of air resistance, or I could give them a space to be able to play with those ideas and come to terms with it. Yes, I realize that in a high-pressure situation of public school teaching, for example, you know, we don't always have that kind of time. So we have to pick and choose a little bit. But if these are big ideas that are going to stay with them for a long time, maybe it's worth allowing their ideas to bubble up, that prior knowledge really to take center stage for a little bit longer before we decide what exactly for new information or content we want to plug in to kind of to fill the holes that they may have. I know that's probably a long and semi-vague answer, but I'd love to talk with you offline about that. There are some great resources you can explore to tackle those issues. Those are fantastic questions.
Okay, well, it is our time to end. It has been 45 minutes, so I wanted to say thank you to everyone for participating in the session today, and thank you for Dr. Gravel for his insights and knowledge and so forth. If you have additional questions, feedback, or ideas, you can feel free to email or contact me by phone. This session has been recorded, and we will be sending out a link to this that you can share with others or review this if you have questions about some of the things that were reviewed today. So again, thank you so much for your time and your interest in iCreate to Educate and SAM Animation, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.